If we could come to order, please. Good evening, councillors, officers, and members of the public that may be joining us via the webcast. I'd like to welcome you to tonight's meeting of Strategic Planning, Sustainability and Transportation Committee. Today, Monday the 13th of November 2017. This is where we pick up from our adjournment at the last meeting. New agendas were circulated, so we will use the running order per the revised papers, but some of us may wish to refer to the original papers where we may have made notes already, so where necessary we'll try and cross-reference the two sets of page numbers. Councillor English, you're indicating?
Yes, Mr. Chairman, it's just that on the previous set of papers we were actually going to take item 7 and item 10 together.
If you'll allow me to explain the running order, I will come to that very, very shortly.
Okay.
We'll do the housekeeping parts. I can advise you there are no planned fire evacuation tests this evening, so if we do hear the bells, please remain seated while Miss Tunnicliffe, the lady to my right, will ascertain the appropriate method of evacuation. And I'd like to remind you all that tonight's proceedings will be webcast by the Council, but I'll ask if anyone else is intending to record. And I'm asking you that not to prevent you, but just so that others in the room may be aware. And I see that nobody's indicating. So as Councillor English was alluding to, we do have at agenda item 7 the reference from Planning Committee, and at the previous meeting we had agreed that the appropriate manner to deal with that would be in the context of agenda items 10 and 11. So with your continued agreement, that will be how we'll manage that item. Thank you. I will take apologies for absence. They are received from Councillor de Wigenden Shepherd, Councillor Willis and Councillor Wilby. I don't think there are any other apologies due, but I'll move to notification of substitute members, please. Just for the record, would you repeat that? Because I don't think the microphone was on.
Councillor Wilson for Councillor Willis.
Councillor Hastie for Councillor Wilby.
Councillor Perry for Councillor de Wigenden.
Thank you, and that is all duly noted. At item 3, may I take notification of visiting members, and for the record, if you would just come to the microphone and indicate if there are any items that you wish to speak to.
Councillor Round, Headcorn Ward, wishing to speak on the new papers 10 and 11.
Councillor Spooner from Bearsted Ward, just to observe and listen. Thank you.
Thank you very much, councillors. I'll next move to item 4, disclosure by members and officers. Are there any disclosures, please? Lots of shaking heads and nobody indicating disclosure, so that's how the minute will record. And we'll now go to item 5, disclosures of lobbying. Are there any disclosures of lobbying? For my own part, I do think that in one way or another I have been lobbied on items 10 and 11. Nobody else wishes to say that? Okay, so I'll just record that. Item 6, if we can give consideration whether any items should be taken in private because of the possible disclosure of exempt information. You'll see that we do indeed have yellow pages at item 11, and at that part of the agenda I will move that we go into part 2. You're agreed? Thank you. I think we've already covered item 7 in so much as we will take that in conjunction with 10.11. So we're now at item 8, This is a report concerning the housing delivery test update, and I shall ask Mr Egerton to start us off.
Thank you, Chairman, and good evening, members. So in the Tuesday's meeting of the committee, we heard Mrs Lee talking about objectively assessed need and the government's proposals for standardised methodology as part of a wider consultation on housing and housing delivery. That objectively assessed need element looks to the future. It considers future delivery and future projections in terms of population, house prices, earnings and that sort of thing to create a standardised methodology. The government, of course, have a broader agenda in this regard, and housing delivery is that overall agenda. Now, this item here is for information, but we would like to draw members' attention to this housing delivery test. Now, the housing delivery test is actually something which originated from the Housing White Paper and with the attempt at fixing the broken housing market. And it proposes that a local planning authority that has an up-to-date local plan should be looking 3 years into the past and measuring delivery against the annual requirement set out in that local plan. So for Maidstone, we are looking at 883 units per annum over a 3-year period, and we are judged against that amount. But conversely, where a local authority doesn't have an adopted plan, the completions are measured against the new proposed standardised methodology, so that would be the 1,236 per annum. Now, the original introduction date for this housing delivery test was to be November, was to be now, and we have been told that that has been postponed, and we haven't been given a fixed date for that coming into effect, but we are thinking that it may well be in spring when the government are announcing a whole raft of other measures, including revisions to the National Planning Policy Framework, for example. So we've adapted our report to illustrate that fact. Now, figure 1, which is provided in the new agenda on page 3, illustrates how the government intends to have a tiered and phased approach to the delivery test's introduction. So it's phased in terms of the overall years. I mean, the November dates we've used as a benchmark, but effectively the point is that year on year the test's measures, the measures which local authorities will be considered against, increase in their severity. So from November 2011, really there is no presumption in favour of sustainable development in the ultimate test, where the local plan has no effect for relevant housing target policies, right up to November 2020, where there is a significant proportion of authorities that may well end up in that bracket. At the same time, the tiered approach represents the ability to pass within 5%, to require an action plan, which is yet to be defined by the government in terms of its requirements, dropping at 10%, and then we start getting into variables where a 20% land buffer is applied and the requirements in favour of sustainable development thereafter. So in terms of Maidstone, I've pointed out in terms of the targets, but I think it's worth noting that we pointed out in the government's consultation that the test penalises local authorities with new local plans in place, and the 3-year transition should be applied. However, given that spring appears to be when the test will be introduced, given the circumstances around our local plan now being adopted, our position as a borough now seems to be a lot stronger. So, turning to the table which is provided on page 5 of the new agenda, that sets out the overall position that we find ourselves in the current day. So we can see that we're judging ourselves against the 883 target. That's the second column, resulting in 2,649 over the 3-year period. The completions, including the 5% buffer, we know we've got 521 in the 15-16 year, 1,145 in the 16-17 year. And then what we have is a future prediction as to what we'll need to ensure whether or not we are either in a position to set out require an action plan or to actually pass with a 5% uplift. Now, there's 2 sources that provide comfort to the authority in this regard and deal with completions during the monitoring year. The first one is the Housing Land Supply Survey, a survey of April 2017, which reported that 1,458 dwellings monitored as under construction, and this gives a good indication that completion rates during this monitoring year, the 2017-18 year, will be similar to the level that we achieved in 2016-17. Furthermore, the monthly completion reports from local authority building control, retrospective planning applications and lawful development certificates indicate there's already been 447 dwellings completed to the 1st of October this year, and that's accounting for 39% of the anticipated delivery. Looking to future years, the Housing Land Supply annually reviews future delivery rates, and a good indication can be attained for in future years the Council's completion rate should be in excess of 95% of the delivery test. And so, in summary, the housing delivery test does, if it does come into effect in April 2018, it's anticipated that completion rates will be high enough level that Maidstone will only be required to apply a 5% buffer. And just a reminder of the recommendation, and that is that the committee notes the contents of this report. Thank you.
Thank you for that very thorough introduction. Councillor English, do you want to get us underway?
Yes, Mr. Chairman. I welcome very much Mr. Edgerton's comments that our own position as a council has strengthened, and that is undoubtedly true. I would observe that this whole process does point out just how fundamentally misconceived successive governments have been about planning delivery. Essentially, councils are going to be penalised, potentially, for non-delivery of housing when most of the factors that cause non-delivery of housing have absolutely nothing to do with the local authority planning system. It's all very well for governments of whatever political colour to bring forward requirements like this, but until something is done about the simple fact that in a free market economy it is not in the interest of developers to bring forward too much housing at the same time, then nothing will change. And therefore, it is, frankly, hitting the wrong target. I'm glad that our position has improved and we need to keep on top of the issue, but it is, once again, the government hitting the wrong people for the wrong things.
Any further comments? That being the case, we're asked to note the report. Is that noted, members? Thank you. We're at agenda item 9. This relates to the public art as a planning policy guidance, and Mrs. Wallace will start us off.
Thank you, Chairman. The purpose of this report is to present the public art guidance, which is in the appendix to this committee for approval, so that it may be used as a material consideration for planning purposes. This document originated from a piece of work which came under the remit of Heritage, Culture and Leisure Committee, which was to produce a public realm design guide and a street furniture guide for the town centre. However, as this piece of work was developing, the issue of public art being a separate borough-wide issue was raised. Heritage, Culture and Leisure Committee recognised that public art required further development and was ultimately a planning issue. It therefore recommended that the matter come under Strategic Planning, Sustainability and Transport Committee's remit, with the agreements of both chairs. Consultants were appointed to work with officers from economic development, strategic planning and development management to develop the document to ensure that it could hold weight in a planning context and to be usable for both planning officers as well as the developers themselves. The key purpose of the document is to encourage public art to be incorporated into new developments at an early stage of the planning process to help create a sense of place and character rather than as an afterthought at the end of the process. The public art guidance also provides various case studies and examples to show developers and planning officers the wide range of types of art, from permanent to embedded and temporary, and a process for developers and planning officers to follow at the pre-application, application and determination stages. The consultants have determined thresholds for the size of the development based on responses from stakeholders, research from elsewhere in the country, and working out a minimum budget which would deliver meaningful public art. By approving the documents, it will ensure opportunities for art will not be missed Additionally, by monitoring the use of the documents, it will allow art to be incorporated into policy once evidence has been gathered. The report therefore recommends that the public art guidance is approved so that it may be used as a material consideration for planning applications validated from the 1st of January 2018. I'm happy to take any questions. Thank you.
Thank you. Councillor Mrs Springett.
Thank you. I notice in the on the case studies, well, somewhere it says the key to any public art process is community engagement, and it mentions that they might have like a steering group as such. Could I ask that local either ward members and/or parish councils are involved where it's a smaller, more rural development that involves community art? Perhaps on a town centre site, the art will be in a prominent public place, but where, for example, in Bearsted we have some housing developments that may involve public art, if it's put in the middle of those 50, 100 houses, 150 houses, it's great for those people, but it's no benefit to the wider community. So I just would like to encourage a little bit of ward member involvement, whereby we could say, for example, in Bearsted, could we put something in the Bearsted Woodland Trust, which a lot more people use. You know, the whole of the village would be affected by the houses that are coming our way, so the public art would benefit the village. So I just somehow want to say, can we have member involvement or parish council involvement or something where it's a smaller, more rural, out-of-town site?
Mrs Wallace.
Yes, certainly. I mean, as part of the application process where it goes through how that should be followed, it's, I'm not sure what page this is in your agendas, but it's item 14 in the actual guidance document. At the pre-application, thank you, it's page 29 on the new agenda. It's at the pre-application stage, from Maidstone Borough Council's point of view, their input, one of the items there is to advise the applicant to involve the local community and ward members and parish councils where appropriate. So we definitely recognise to encourage that.
Thank you. Just want to come back on that. You won't be aware, but Clive and the chair will be aware. I have made the point recently that at pre-app discussion, members aren't always aware of it going on or always involved. So it's great to put it at the pre-app stage, provided we know there's a pre-app going on. Thank you.
Councillor English.
May I say I welcome this report. It's a good step forward. On the point that Councillor Springett just made, on page 20, the famous Nolan statue, the idea for this actually came from local residents originally because of local concern about a previous memorial that was actually in the church, which had disappeared. So all I would say is that I do agree with Councillor Springett, but it's not just in the rural areas where there's community involvement, and indeed there are parish councils like Tovel, which is Downswood, which are very urban. So yes, I think we need to recognise that art projects really only work and last when there is community involvement and support for it. It's very noticeable actually how how the community has responded to this particular artwork in particular, and not just that one. What I would say is I really welcome this report, but it's the beginning of an important process. There's work still to be done on bringing this forward, developing it, and in due course having robust planning policies. But adopting this as a material planning consideration and taking this forward will be a significant step forward. Not just for making the town look borough look better and more attractive, but public art can have a significant impact on the economy of a place. It may seem left centre field, but the amount of tourists you get looking at war memorials such as this, and this is a war memorial of sorts, is significant, quite significant, and we shouldn't underestimate the economic benefits of recognising Maidstone's long and interesting history. I was going to say glorious, but it's not all glorious, as those who will know the Nolan statue's history will recognise. So if it hasn't already been done, I'd like to move the recommendation.
So the recommendation is moved. Before I come to you, Councillor Mrs Wilson, a couple of points from myself. I think one of the things I hope we will take forward from this particular exercise is the need to synchronise different work streams from different committees at a much earlier stage. Bringing this to this stage, it's been hanging for ages. So I'm sure next time around we'll all be joined up at a much earlier stage. One very direct question then. My concern is that there's a finite amount of money that can be extracted from development. And what I'm really looking for is the assurance that having this additional ask on the list will in no way be detrimental to those things that we might consider to be essentials. I don't know who's best placed to answer that.
Thank you, Chairman. I think I'll start just very briefly by saying that while we were creating this guidance, Fine Francis Knight led on it, we were very keen to ensure that there was developer involvement. We hold developer forums as an authority, and we use that as an opportunity to ask for developers themselves to almost test the sort of reasonableness of what we're proposing and whether or not they could deliver this, including the threshold. And so following that, a group of developers volunteered to be part of that and to sort of test this guidance. And I'm pleased to say that what you actually have in front of you today is the result of that process. So that gives me extra confidence that developers will be able to sort of absorb costs for this public art. And obviously, notwithstanding the other requirements, bring this forward. But I would say that, of course, there always is a hierarchy, and that you're absolutely right. There is a finite amount of money that developers have to play with. It's down to officers to make sure that we try to bring forward the public art guidance and make sure that the requirements are enforced, but also there's a role there for members as well. But I hope some confidence can be taken from the fact that developers themselves have been engaged and involved in this process and have provided their input in its development.
Mr. Jarvis.
Just a direct response to your question. In the local plan, we set out infrastructure priorities for residential development and business and retail development for the very reasons you've just outlined.
I think that's the assurance that I wanted. And I'm glad to hear that developers, out of the kindness of their heart, are going to put that little bit extra in. Councillor Mrs Wilson, I said I'd come to you next.
Oh, yes, it is on. I better start by saying that what I was just about to say made me realise I should have disclosed that I'm actually on the Heritage, Culture and Leisure Committee, and so I want to speak to it, partly because I'm the only person from that committee here to say, please, I hope you do adopt it. But on a wider note, public and local involvement is vital wherever it is, because the one message I've picked up from residents over the years, over and over again, is that they want their art to relate to where they live, whether in some way, and not this art comes in all shapes and forms. And if I say the sort of airy-fairy, that people don't quite understand what it is, and there's all sorts of different ways of doing that. And art doesn't necessarily take a shed load of money. It can, if you go for a full-blown bronze statue, but there are other ways of incorporating art. If you get it in early enough, you can incorporate it into design, and it actually costs next to nothing more than an ordinary design would have done. I'd just like to make one correction. As my colleague here has just pointed out, it's Louis Nolan, not Louise Nolan. And if we're going, to have a document, we ought to get that right. And directly to Councillor Springett, I have long had the ambition that we should have a statue to the Scarlet Pimpernel in Bearsted because the authoress lived there and he is one of the iconic heroes of literature. You should applaud that and take it. So may I know other people put up their hands, but may I second that we actually do adopt this?
Okay. I guess for now we'll just have to seek him here and seek him there. But on that note, perhaps we can move to the vote if nobody else wishes to speak. So as per the papers, sorry, was that an indication of somebody to speak? No? No? So as per the papers, moved by Councillor English, seconded by Councillor Mrs Wilson. Those in favour, please. That is unanimous and therefore carried. Thank you, members. Thank you, officers, for your forbearance and returning for another evening. Agenda item 10, the white papers relating to the planning review update report. I shall turn to Mr Cornell to see if he wants to say anything at this stage.
Yes, thank you, Chairman. In terms of the recommendation for the report, it's just for noting, and it might be the appropriate thing if we do the noting now, and then I can deliver a brief presentation in the exempt section where some of the questions may sort of relate to the annex to the report. But
okay, well, taking a sounding of faces, I don't think there's any chance of noting it at this stage until we've got some substance. So that being the case, I think it would be appropriate to move to the next agenda item and therefore into part 2, unless there's anything further to be added in open session at this stage. And with that, we would be taking the consideration of the reference from Planning Committee. We can come back to part 1 if we want to afterwards. Councillor English?
If we are so minded, we could come back and report any motion that is agreed to this committee in part 1 at the end of the part 2 discussion.
Yeah, I think that's what I was just saying. We can come back into part 1 at the end if we wish to do so. Okay, then. So I move that the public be excluded for the items set out in part 2 of the agenda because of the likely disclosure of exempt information.
Thank you very much, Mr Chairman. I welcome the confirmation that the reference from Planning Committee will be being taken forward and that the Director will be circulating an appropriate email to members outlining how that process will be taken forward. And thank you very much for taking it on board.
Members content with that course of action? Is that agreed? Thank you. I believe that concludes our business for tonight's agenda, and I'm happy to announce the meeting closed.